Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the least important recording projects ever. And I'm going to talk about one that has come up actually, a few thousand videos ago, just by way of an update and to reinforce its complete unnecessariosity. I'm talking about the entirety of Andris Nelson's recordings on Deutsche Grammophon. Boy, talk about a bad bunch of choices. What were we told a couple of years ago when this whole imbroglio began? Well, that Andris Nelson, who's conductor of the Boston Symphony, was going to be doing a Shostakovich cycle in Boston, a Beethoven cycle in Vienna, and a Bruckner cycle in Leipzig. That's what we were going to get, whether we wanted it or not. That's what we were going to get. So where are we now? Well, where are we now is that the Beethoven, he sort of waltzed into Vienna one weekend and did all 9 symphonies, and that's what they sound like. There's not a single distinctive, interesting bar in any of those performances that makes them in any way interesting or necessary or worth hearing. They're just boring and completely, undistinguished. Let's just leave it at that, because that's what they are, and pointless. Who needed another Beethoven cycle, right? I mean, it's the definition of insignificance and contempt, because Beethoven cycles ought to be special. We've had this conversation, right? I mean, they're not the kind of things that people just toss off. And have we had any evidence in his entire career that Andris Nelson's had any special feeling for Beethoven? I mean, it's not a crime. It's not a crime not to be an avatar of the German school. You can do it nicely. I'm sure in Boston he's given decent performances of Beethoven symphonies. They're fine to go see of an evening, but to preserve it with the Vienna Philharmonic? I mean, and the whole reason to get the Vienna Philharmonic is because they know it better than he does. So whatever you're going to get the Vienna Philharmonic doing its usual thing, usually with more than a soupçon of laziness and lack of interest, because they've done it a billion times, and they know from the first downbeat whether this guy has anything interesting to give to the music. Well, on evidence here, he did not. So that was the Beethoven cycle. Then we come to Bruckner. Oh, yes. I mean, which they did in Leipzig. I mean, Leipzig's done a bunch of boring Bruckner cycles, really boring ones. I mean, they did a terrible one with Blomstedt. They did a more terrible one with Mazur. And now they've done a terrible one with Andris Nelson. You'd think that these people would have listened to the Bruckner coming out of Leipzig and said, well, maybe it's not so good. Maybe we shouldn't bother. It's not that they can't play it, of course. It's that what do we have from Andris Nelson's career that tells us that he should be doing Bruckner cycles, other than the fact that everybody's doing them these days? They're trying to turn him into the new Mahler and just issuing record after record after record after record of Bruckner symphonies. And Bruckner does not sell. I mean, the vast majority of the classical music public is not interested in Bruckner. There is a Bruckner cult that is interested in Bruckner. And, he's not unpopular, but he's no Mahler, he's no Beethoven, he's not a Tchaikovsky. I mean, none of those things. And Nelson has no feeling for that music at all. These are the dullest and not even well recorded. Oh my goodness, they're awful. You can check out my reviews of some of them over at ClassicsToday.com to get a sense of just how dreary they are. They came coupled with Wagner orchestral excerpts, some of which were actually pretty good, which were usually a little bit better. But seriously, if there was ever anything we don't need, it's another boring Bruckner cycle. Another Bruckner cycle, period. I mean, people just churn these things out these days. And you wonder why. Who's out there waiting in line for the next one other than the Bruckner crazies? I don't know. I don't get it. Of course, the Bruckner anniversary is coming up. I mean, all the symphonies in all their various versions, and the Bruckner military industrial complex is doing its very best to churn out hundreds of new editions of everything that he did so that you can record 50 versions of each symphony. I mean, the whole thing is just sick. It's completely sick. And it's just enough to say that Nelson's has nothing to say in Bruckner. Now, the most interesting of the possibilities here is Shostakovich. First of all, because finally he's doing it in Boston, which is interesting because Boston has never done a Shostakovich cycle. And the fact of the matter is that in the old days, when a music director is head of a major orchestra, he would work with that orchestra for several years, and then they would forge an identity and a symbiotic relationship that had a certain specialness and sound and character, and then that character would be applied in the service of the great classics of the repertoire. So you would get a Beethoven cycle and maybe even a Bruckner cycle with an orchestra that was not necessarily used to doing that music, or it was not doing that music. It wasn't known for that music. It didn't have the reputation. They weren't like Vienna, you know what I mean, to do Beethoven. But they do it wonderfully well, and they would do it in their own way, and it would be interesting. For just that reason, it would be special and unusual and different and someone else's take on Beethoven. But that's not how record labels think these days. Nowadays, they have everybody pigeonholed as their repertory speciality. And if you want to do Beethoven, you have to do it in Vienna. So they're all going to sound the same unless the conductor is a genius. And what are the chances of that, right? So it's horrible. It's stupid. And the only interesting bright note was the Shostakovich in Boston, because you get to hear a great, great, great orchestra, not so known for that repertoire, doing that music. And this is the only composer of the three that Nelson's actually seemed to have some affinity for. I mean, he likes it. He's done it before. He recorded Shostakovich in Birmingham for Orfeo. Some of it was quite good. And some of these Shostakovich recordings have been very, very good. There are more good ones than bad ones. And again, you can see my reviews of most of the ones that have come out over at classicstoday.com if you're interested. So that was the interesting thing. But, there's always a but, isn't there? These have been coming out in such a way so as to render them as insignificant as everything else in the cycle, because they get no promotion. They have a title, Under Stalin's Shadow. Except for the ones that weren't written under Stalin's shadow. And they've been coming out in sort of clumps of 2 or 3 symphonies on 2 discs, and they're not finished. The other ones are finished. Of course, Shostakovich wrote more symphonies, and it's more of a complicated situation, probably, and an expensive situation. It's about money, because they haven't done Babi Yar. I don't think they've done 13 and 2 and 3. I think that's the last batch of them. And those are all the ones that require a chorus. And, and nobody wants to hear 2 or 3 anyway, because nobody likes them. And they're arguably some of the weakest in the batch. They haven't done 12 yet either, I don't think. We're still waiting for 12. Another one of the ones that doesn't get a lot of love in the general musical community. So if you're doing a cycle, it's bad planning. You've got to know that at some point you're going to be doing these 3 or 4 works that nobody especially cares about, but you got to do them anyway, and you've got to program them. And of course, COVID, interrupted things. I understand stuff happens. I get that, but by the time this thing is done, it will be completely unnecessary and unimportant, and nobody will care. I think a Shostakovich cycle from Boston is important because it's a Shostakovich cycle from Boston. I don't care who's conducting it. I really don't. Fortunately, Nelson's is a good Shostakovich conductor. But at the same time, it can be done in such a way as to completely minimize the significance. And one way to do that is to issue Beethoven from Vienna and Bruckner from the Gewandhaus and treat the Shostakovich as though it's a second-class, throwaway, non-essential component, when it ought to be the only highlight and interesting thing of this entire recording program. It's a total mess. in terms of the public perception and DG's policy. And I just wish none of it had happened until Nelson's was ready, until he'd had enough time to do something hopefully wonderful or thoughtful with his career in Boston. It's hopeless. It's hopeless to ask a conductor today not to jet set around, not to spend only a few weeks with the orchestra they're nominally the music director of, not to try and do anything distinctive or meaningful. I mean, to do what Ormandy did, or even Riccardo Muti in Philadelphia, or some of these people, they spent at least a decade or two with their orchestras working, really working to create something distinctive. That's not happening. It almost never happens. And when it does happen, you've got to have a great conductor. One of the sort of saddest might have beens was, for example, Simon Rattle in Birmingham. He really created something in Birmingham. He did. He built that orchestra. He gave it an international reputation. He devoted his full time and attention to it. And he had the entire, English old boy network behind him. And so he was able to do it. The trouble is, he's just not that interesting a conductor. That's a shame. But he did the work. He put the work in, and for that he deserves full credit. I don't understand personally, and now I'm just ranting, but I have to finish this up with a rant, why it is that a conductor who gets one of the world's great orchestras, like Boston, or if he had gotten the Gewandhaus or Vienna, whatever it is, but in this case it's Boston, doesn't drop everything and just work in Boston, because he's been given a jewel, a priceless, precious musical legacy that needs to be cherished and husbanded, and he has the opportunity to mold it in his own image. There's such an opportunity to be musically distinctive and fabulous, and they don't care at all. I don't even think they understand the issue. I think it's just another feather in their cap. They get a big salary, they go to the orchestra, that's where they are. It's the same thing with Yannick Nézet-Séguin in Philadelphia. I mean, these people, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. And when they do make recordings, it's usually not with their orchestra. I mean, the money's available if you need to find money to pay for these things, but they don't have anything to say, and they don't care. And that's why Andris Nelson's recordings for Deutsche Grammophon to date constitute absolutely one of the least important recording projects ever. Period. Exclamation point. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.